today we get to start on chapter 14. And this is going to be a nice chapter to transition into. And I might be doing this more in the future, where a lot of the stuff we were talking about when it came to personality, some of the stuff about how people handle stress actually ends up tying into personality. So this is a nice logical connection here. And we'll eventually get into not just a discussion of sort of what is stress, we'll also start looking about how individuals think about stress, how they might think about how they can handle stress and how that affects how it affects them. And then we'll also look a little bit at health and how being stressed actually affects our physiology, and looking at a bunch of correlational studies where in the long run, as nobody was probably surprised, stress tends to be bad for a whole bunch of different things. And yeah, so we'll touch on a bunch of different areas here, but as per usual, we're gonna find that this is probably a much larger and more in-depth topic than what we can cover in an intro course. So there will be a lot of, here's an area of study and here's a slide on it. If you want to do more, you kind of have to take higher up classes, but we'll at least get an introduction here. And our starting point here, typically I start my chapters off with, hey, this is what the chapter's called, here's a definition of what it's called. But as we've seen a little bit lately, defining stress actually ends up being a little bit ambiguous again, but for slightly different reasons. And here, the reason why it's hard to get a definition for stress is because we can use the word stress to refer to a bunch of different things. So you might talk about something in your environment is a stress or a stressor because it's some external environmental stimulus that is causing stress. So we might view that as an external stress source. We might also talk about our internal experiences and our internal bodily responses. We are experiencing stress. So in both cases, stress is kind of an appropriate term. And to avoid confusion, typically we start seeing the literature uses two slight modifiers, where if we're talking about our external environmental stimuli, stuff in our environment that is giving us that feeling of potential for harm or loss or damage in some way or form, we'll call it a stressor. So a stressor is something that is in our environment, something that we would view as potentially maybe interrupting our internal balance. So it could be a physical harm, it could be a psychological harm, it could just be that it's taking more resources than we have right now. All of that would count as being a stressor. In contrast, if we talk about a stress response, we're talking about that internal physiological component. And this is going to include a bunch of different aspects as per usual. It's going to include that natural physiological activation. So we have a system that's responding to stress. We'll talk a lot about our fight or flight system, and we'll go into more depth soon. But it also includes some of our cognitive aspects as well. So what we are thinking about, and maybe we have things like racing thoughts that deal with this stress. So a stress response can be cognitive as well. So yeah, we want to kind of keep in mind that the terminology is a little bit difficult. So I try and make it really clear if we're talking about something internal or external by quantifying it. But if you're ever reading the literature, hopefully people will make it clear from context. But yeah, this is our little nitpicky thing for the chapter where the term stress is ambiguous unless adequately given context. So stress can be internal or external, and we can look at the things that cause the stress or our reaction to that stress and everything in between. So let's start off with our internal components. And so here we're actually going to be focusing a lot on the importance of our individual perception. And this is why this follows nicely from our previous personality chapter, where we had some of our, say, our humanistic perspectives that were really focused in on how individuals perceive the situation, not necessarily on the reality of the situation. That applies here as well. where we're going to have what are called appraisals, which is when we take a look at the scenario and figure out what are we dealing with and how can we respond. And so an individual's reaction to a environmental stressor is going to be based on what we think we see, what we think we need to do, and how we think we can cope with that. So let's talk about this. So first is our primary appraisal. So it comes first. And this is going to be based on our perception of the characteristics of that particular environmental stressor. We're going to look at the magnitude of the demands and the relevance. So if we look at something in our environment, maybe we have a test coming up in a class. So in this situation, you're going to start considering, okay, well, what is it? It's a test. Okay, what do I need to do for that? How much studying do I need to do? How many marks am I getting for this? Is this something that's super important for my future? So if this is something that's worth a huge portion of your grades and it's relevant for your degree and it's something that's going to take a bunch of time, you're going to appraise it as something that's probably fairly threatening to you. We also then want to consider our secondary appraisals that's based on our perceptions of the resources that we have available to cope with that particular stressor. So you know what you need to know to take the test. How much studying is that going to take? And how much time do you have available to study? How much do you already know that you are comfortable with versus what do you have to figure out from here? Are you going to be on a time crunch? Are there other things that are pulling resources? So you're going to start thinking about a bunch of different things there. And this is going to be, our secondary appraisal is going to be influenced by both internal and external factors. So things like our personality. So I had mentioned before, optimism versus pessimism can absolutely influence this. So if you are naturally pessimistic by nature, you might look at all the things that you haven't learned yet. You'd focus more on what's lacking and be more discouraged. This is more of a challenge than you thought. Versus if somebody is more optimistic, maybe they look at all the good stuff, the stuff they've already done, look at how far we've come, it's a more positive outlook. You might feel more capable of handling this scenario. You also have your personal abilities. If this is a class that you're really good at, and you already have a ton of knowledge, you might be a lot more positive approaching this. You might feel like you're in a better place. You might have a better secondary appraisal because I've done this before, I'm really good at this, I'm confident in my abilities. In terms of external sources, this can be things like, do you have social support or financial resources or somebody to encourage you, give you those words of encouragement. Having that present can actually be really beneficial. So maybe you're not your best cheerleader, but maybe you have a friend who reminds you of all the times you've done well on tests, and all of a sudden you're going to have a much more positive secondary appraisal. And it's important to note that these appraisals aren't just sort of one and done. We tend to reappraise situations fairly often. So as we start acquiring resources, we might reevaluate and say, hey, I finished this, so now I have more resources that are going to help me do better on this task. You might be less intimidated by it. So yeah, we tend to reevaluate situations fairly often. So this is a very active and changing and evolving process. And based on our findings, after we've done our two types of appraisals, once we've looked at what are our demands, what is the thing that we need to do for that scenario, we've looked at the resources we have available to meet those demands, then we're going to make a determination. We're going to decide, is this a challenge or is this a threat? And so the idea being a challenge would be a situation where we have more resources than the demand requires. We have tons of stuff in our back pocket. Our secondary appraisal, we did great. We already know all these things. We have more time than we need to prepare for that exam. So I'm going to view it as a challenge. This is a positive framing. So this is going to give us that potential for a positive outcome and gain being more likely in this situation. So we're going to frame it positively. We're going to go forth and feel like we're going to conquer. Versus if we have a situation where the demands exceed our resources available to cope with those demands, then we're going to perceive it as a threat. So in this situation, we don't think that we have the resources necessary to accomplish that particular task. And in this situation, we get a much more negative framing of, there are so many demands, there are so many things I need to do, and I don't have time to do it. I don't have the knowledge to do it. I don't have the resources to do it. And you're going to focus on the negative there. And this can be perceived sort of as danger or uncertainty or uncontrollability and stuff like that being involved here. But yeah, this diagram actually does a really nice summary. This is one that I borrowed from a different text, but we have this potential stressor from our environment. We do the primary appraisal, so what demands are associated with it, so what is it that we need to do. Then we get our secondary appraisal, and then we say, okay, what resources do we have available to us? And then we decide, okay, do the demands exceed the resources, or the resources exceed the demands? And we go threat or challenge. So it's kind of a nice simplifying way of doing that. But yeah, if we run into a scenario where we have really high demands, if something is very difficult or requires a lot of effort, it takes a lot of time, takes a lot of thinking. If it's something new and we've never tried it before, if we don't have previous experience, we might be overestimating the demands, but we might also be underestimating our abilities in that scenario because of lack of experience. If it's something that's out of our control, so if there's no way for us to take control of the scenario, we might then also frame it as being more potentially threatening because we feel more confident, we feel more in charge when we can actually influence the events. And danger, of course, so if there's actual physical threat involved, it can be framed as more threatening. So there's a whole bunch of different stuff that can be of influence here. And again, ties in with how are we thinking about this? And like we said, things like depression and anxiety can absolutely influence how we tend to frame things. But this can also tie into things like personality types. So we had looked at our introversion versus extroversion. What if we have to give a talk in front of a class and we are introverted? Then that being confident and talking to a class would be a higher demand on us. There's more resources required, it's going to take more energy, and it's going to be more stressful, so we might frame it one way versus the other. So there's all sorts of stuff running along in the background, but this is our basic evaluation here. As I said at the beginning, there are so many other things running in the background, and we just get to touch on them very, very briefly. But our next section is looking at different types of stress. And so in this situation, this is kind of as in-depth as we get into specific types of stressors, where we can divide them up into acute versus chronic stressors. Some texts, and this is where I start pulling from multiple resources, some texts also make a separate category for things that are traumatic stressors. So if there's any kind of physical threat involved, then it can sometimes be treated differently, just because it can have a more dramatic impact on the individuals. So most texts only focus on something being acute or chronic. Is it short-term or long-term? And then, yeah, they don't agree on how we handle the other categories. So we're going to mainly focus on acute and chronic. And the difference here being with acute stressors, they tend to be short-term situations. So we have those external things that are causing stress, and they tend to last for that sort of minutes to hours, maybe into the days category. And once again, people are going to have to define this for each study you look at because these terms don't have hard cutoffs between them. Typically, acute stressors, because of that shorter duration, tend also to be smaller in intensity, so they're not as severe. Whereas chronic stressors, they're going to be more enduring exposures to stress. And these can last weeks to years. And one of the hardest parts with the chronic stressors is that these threatening events tend to not have an apparent time limit. So this is something that's ongoing with no sort of set end point. So this is something like chronic illness, or if you always commute the same way to work, and it is always a terrible commute, maybe you hate driving or something like that, but you have to do it every day until you retire some distant point off in the unforeseen future, we could frame that as something chronic. Most of the time, the research is going to call chronic stuff, it's almost always chronic illness. But for the acute stuff, it's short term, it's usually less severe, and it has a clear endpoint, which is why it tends to be less impactful. And this is beyond what you need to know for this class, but even if you're in really bad situations, so if we look at, they've done this in like learned helplessness studies with rats, which I think we've mentioned before, but basically if they have rats that get exposure to shock, a shock is an aversive stimulus, so it's a pretty common way for them to study stress in rats. If the rats get a signal that tells them when the shocks will happen, or if they get a safety signal that says when the shocks will not happen, they go about their lives perfectly normally, despite getting shocked at random points, as long as they know when it happens or won't happen. If you have the same rats with no foreknowledge, if there's no signal, either warning or safety, all of a sudden they start showing depression symptoms, they stop eating, they show lethargy, all of these things. So the delivery of the shocks in this situation is irrelevant. It's the knowledge of when that completely changes how they frame it.
Be able to prepare yourself for it.
Yeah, exactly. And so having that information actually really takes off a lot of the stress that comes with it. So that's another thing that kind of ties into this. So yeah, foreknowledge as well as control are massive factors when it comes to how impacted people are by stressful scenarios. Yeah, for whatever reason, if we feel like we're in control or if we feel like we know what's coming, we are less affected. We feel a little bit more positive. But as soon as we lose that knowledge, as soon as there's uncertainty, it starts causing big problems, which is really interesting. But yeah. Oh, and then just some examples. So yeah, we talked about something like, hey, there's traffic today. That is something acute, and you know that the traffic will be over whenever rush hour is over, or whenever you reach your exit and can go home. I always find, because I take the same route home every single day, and some days because I have to drive by the arena where they have the hockey games, and so sometimes it's, 10 minutes and I'm home, and other days I'm like, why are there so many people? I have to sit for so long and wait for so many buses, and it feels really frustrating at the time. It's really stressful at the time because I just want to go home at the end of the day, but I know it's going to end, and it only happens sometimes. Yeah, with our example for chronic, it's almost always long-term illness, and this can be the person with the illness, but it can also be those who care for those with an illness, because that itself can be stressful. And most of the literature focuses on illness and caretakers for illness in some way, shape, or form. And then the traumatic, that ties into things like maybe a natural disaster or a personal trauma. But yeah, so now that we've kind of given a bunch of definitions, we've talked about how we start considering things, what else do we need to know? So the first concept here is the concept of frustration. And so frustration, pretty simple definition, is a feeling of being upset or annoyed. And this is especially if it's due to our inability to change or achieve something. So we tend to be really easily frustrated if stuff is out of our control. So again, we come back to that. We want to feel like we can influence stuff. So if stuff's out of our control, we might start feeling frustration. If we fail to achieve a goal, if we tie back to our motivation and emotions, we can feel frustration there too. And sometimes frustration can actually end up leading to aggression because we're so frustrated. We have all this extra energy and we want to release it somehow, so maybe we lash out. If we study frustration, once again in rats, what they do is they actually put in a bite bar. It's a plexiglass bar that has a sensor on it, and they register how many times does the rat bite this thing. And so they'll do things like, okay, we're going to have the rat press a button to get food. And then once they've learned that the button gets them food, we're going to stop giving them food when they press it. And what we find is that as soon as they are no longer getting the thing they anticipate, they are no longer getting their reward, they start biting instead. And so they're sort of venting out some of their anger, their frustration through that attacking motion. when it comes to a more psychological definition, and this was why I kind of clarified, I had to look up frustration, I just pulled it from like dictionary.com, but for psychology, we're specifically saying, okay, our emotion or our internal state that we're experiencing when we fail to pursue a particular goal. So very similar to our standard usage, which is nice for once. So yeah, can lead to aggression, doesn't always, but it's very common for situations when we're stressed, especially if we feel like there's nothing else we can do. Another thing that we can talk about and tie to other concepts is this idea of internal conflict. And so this would be something that we can think back to, hey, wasn't this a very Freudian thing? Where Freud was all about that inner conflict where we have our ego and our id trying to compete to sort of act on urges and prevent those urges, and that conflict of two opposing motivations creates tension. Same idea here, but without it having to rely on our deep, dark subconscious stuff that the psychodynamic theory thrives on. So here, for us, conflict would just be having two or more incompatible motivations. So we have certain impulses or things that we want, and they end up competing for expression. And this is something that was studied actually not too long after the psychodynamic theory was fairly common, which is probably why it's easy to run parallels. But this was done in the 1930s, and Lewin proposed 3 different basic types of conflict. So he described the approach-approach conflict, and that's when we have to choose between 2 attractive goals. So you're at a restaurant and they have your 2 favorite meals on the menu. And so now you have to pick, do you want this favorite meal or that favorite meal? Regardless of your choice, you're still getting something good. So this tends not to be a massive source of stress, but there is still that little bit of conflict because you need to start weighing your pros and cons. You need to make a decision between 2 very appealing choices. Not necessarily a bad place to be. Next, we get our avoidance conflict. And this is when you have to choose between 2 unattractive goals. So this is when you don't want to do either, but you kind of have to pick one. So maybe you have to choose between, maybe you have an illness and you have to choose between maintaining your lifestyle with that illness or undergoing some awful treatment to get rid of it. That is 2 not great options, and you have to decide which one is sort of the lesser of those 2 evils. So you can choose between those. Another option would be, hey, you have to choose between having no money or working a job that you hate. Those are bad options, and you have to pick one. So you might write up your pro and con list, and whichever one has the fewer bad outcomes, that's what you're going to go with. In this situation, because no matter what you choose, it's going to lead to unhappiness, this tends to be the most stressful of the choices. So this is unfortunately going to cause the most stress, the most conflict. And the last one, approach avoidance, is actually really interesting because in this situation, you're not choosing between 2 good or 2 bad things. Now you have only one thing, but you have to choose, do you want it or not? And that one thing has both positive and negative aspects. So you have to choose, do I want to go after this one goal that has attractive and unattractive components? So you might have to decide, hey, do I want to ask this person out knowing that they might accept and I get a partner, or they might decline and I'd feel embarrassment? Or do I want to invest in this particular thing where if it goes well, I will make money, but if it goes poorly, I will lose money? So there are pros and cons to each. And in a lot of cases in these situations, we actually end up with what's called vacillation, where we're basically oscillating between one choice and the other. So sometimes it feels like we absolutely should make this decision. Sometimes it feels like we should say no to it. And we're going to flop back and forth between the 2 because we are indecisive. And it's usually going to depend on things like how are you framing it right now, what's your mood right now, and things like that. But yeah, so those are Lewin's different types of conflict. Our next section gets into life events and how changes to our lives can cause or influence our stress and stress responses. So a lot of research on stress will actually look at different events, and they actually tend to have categories of these different life events, so things that can happen in your life, and they'll rank them on how stressful they typically are. And the more of these stressful events that you have, the higher you score on this particular index, meaning that you would score having very high stress levels in your life. So if we want to have our definition here, our life changes, it's basically any substantial alteration to our living circumstances. If it's something that you have to adapt to and adjust to, then it counts as a life change. And the reason, or I guess the logic behind this is that change can be stressful, and if we're trying to quantify stress, which is something that's fairly abstract in most cases, we usually just want to figure out, hey, how many events are happening and how much stress do they typically cause people? And one of the cool parts about this is they include both good and bad changes, because change in general can cause stress. Yeah, so it can be something like, hey, you lost your job. That's a bad stress. That counts. But something like, say, getting married. If you are marrying somebody that you love, that is usually a positive change, but it's still a stressful scenario.
Starting university?
Yep, starting university, literally anything that causes a change. And this diagram here, I just borrowed this from one of the standard indexes of different life events that they count and the different way they tend to score them. All you really need to know is there's a bunch of different indices, and they all basically have lists of, in the past X amount of time, have you experienced this, yes or no? And then at the end, we tally it up. And some of these they'll focus on in the last year. Sometimes they'll focus on 10 years, and sometimes they'll look at cumulative lifetime accumulation. It all depends on the type of research that they're doing. And typically the idea being that the more events that happen, you get a higher stress score, and it tends to then correlate with all the other negative stuff that goes with stress. But yeah. We also, in these situations, typically find that while they do often consider positive changes as well, good changes, the negative changes, the bad stuff, tends to have a stronger effect, so it tends to be weighted higher. And all of those weightings tend to be very subjective, and it depends on the different index you're using, but at least they're trying. Another thing to consider is this feeling of pressure. So if we've described our frustration, that's one of our categories. Pressure is a different thing to consider. And this is basically us handling expectations or demands that we should be behaving a particular way, or we should be accomplishing a certain thing. So some examples, we can have time pressure. So if you're under a time crunch, there's a deadline coming up and you need to finish your paper by that date, that counts. Pressure to conform, we've talked about this before, that push to match our group expectations. We might also have performance pressure. You have to meet a particular goal or a particular standard or a particular level of performance. All of those can create stress. And one of the hard parts here is that this can be either real pressure, but it can also be perceived pressure. So once again, this can be self-enforced stuff. So you might assume that you are supposed to act a certain way, or you might put your own deadlines on yourself. So maybe your paper is due at the end of March, but you want it done a week early so you don't get stressed. But now you're under a time crunch for your own deadline versus for the real deadline. So is that better or worse? It depends on the scenario. But yeah, so all of these different sources of pressure can come from either ourselves or from others, internal or external. And this applies to all sorts of different things. Okay, so that's a bunch of like random, very quick, here are some terms and how we apply them and some of the background considerations. Our next couple of sections are actually going to be dealing with how we actually respond to stress. And the way that our text, and most of the texts actually do this, is we break it down into 3 different levels of responding. So we're going to look at emotional responses, which will be a lot of review from when we talked about emotion and motivation. We're then going to look at some physiological responses, so what's going on inside our bodies. And that'll be a callback to 104 when we were talking about especially our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. We're also going to look at our endocrine system, where some of our hormones are active. And then eventually we'll get into some of our behavioral responses. So what actions do we make? And so this is just setting us up here where we can have our potentially stressful events at the beginning. We then have our appraisals that we've talked about before, so we're kind of orienting ourselves to stuff we've seen already. So the event occurs, we appraise, we are going to decide threat or challenge, and then we're going to have some kind of reaction. We are going to respond in some way, shape, or form. So we'll look at the emotions, the physiological stuff, and then the behavioral stuff. When people are stressed, we tend to react emotionally. That is not a surprising statement. We can also probably not be surprised if we say that this is a very complicated and changing and fluid relationship between stress and emotion. There's a lot of other forces going on in the background here. And while, of course, people want to figure out, hey, how are people going to feel when they encounter this scenario? Psychologists love predicting stuff, but we're going to be very aware at this point that for something as complicated as stress and how we internalize it and then how we react to it, this is a really hard connection to draw. So there isn't really any one emotion that we see for any one type of stressor. It tends to be far more complicated than that. And we've already been hinting at that so far in terms of our appraisals and how people can frame things in slightly different ways. If you framed it as a challenge versus a threat, 2 people can be facing the exact same stressor and frame it as completely opposing ideas. And again, if we go back to our exam example, if you have somebody who is a psych major, and this is the thing that they are passionate about and they've been studying all semester, that exam is going to be a challenge and they're probably maybe not excited for it, but at least prepared. But if somebody is taking this as an elective and they really don't care all that much, then maybe it's going to be a lot more stressful for them, and maybe that upcoming exam is a threat because they haven't studied all semester and now there's a lot to learn. So same scenario, same event, same stimulus, 2 people, very different evaluations, and then because of those different evaluations and their experiences and what they care about, their reactions can be very different. So yeah, it gets far more complicated than that. Typically, we have some groupings of different emotions that we are not surprised to see acted on if we are feeling stress. So things like apprehension and anxiety and fear would probably be fairly common. So this would be, hey, maybe we see something and it's threatening and we're not quite sure how to handle it. Those would be fairly common. We also tend to see annoyance and rage and anger. So maybe we're feeling powerless and want to lash out. Those would all kind of group together. And sometimes if we've maybe failed to achieve one of these goals, we might see dejection and sadness and grief, some more negative internal-based emotions. So all of these wouldn't necessarily be surprising, but we could have different people reacting to the exact same scenario in all of these ways. And once again, we come back to these are all negative type emotions, or at least they're framed negatively. But if we have some of our more positive emotions, so we're looking at the ones that have more of that sort of increased arousal in our brains, they tend to be more protective. So same as when we were talking about sort of optimism versus pessimism and how we frame stuff, where optimism tends to have better outcomes. That would also then tie to, if you are more likely to have that positive outlook, it tends also to have better outcomes as well. With lots and lots of research on this, though, of course, we have had individuals like Lazarus in 2006 did a whole bunch of different correlations, and they figured out that certain cognitive reactions, some of our appraisals, how we are thinking about things, can be tied to specific emotions. That is a little bit easier to predict. So it's harder to go from stressor to appraisal to emotion, but if we go just appraisal to emotion, that part we're better at. So if somebody is framing it with sort of a self-blaming interpretation, they tend to then feel guilty because they feel like they are at fault. And if they are framing it as something that is, they're feeling helpless, if they have no control, there's nothing they can do, they might then feel sadness. There's a couple of others that they've linked together, but these are the ones that kind of make the most logical of links. And at the bottom here, we're seeing that, hey, chronic negative emotions. So if people tend to frame stuff negatively and have those negative emotional reactions to them, we typically also see more negative health outcomes, just like the positive ones tend to be more protective. And we'll look more later on at some of these correlation studies. But a lot of them have the same basic take home. That is, sort of negative framings and negative emotions tend to cause problems with health in the long run. We'll also see that they can actually have some negative outcomes in the short run as well, but we'll get there eventually. I will remind you once again about this relationship between our emotional arousal and performance, also officially called the Yerkes-Dodson law. This is when we have that relationship between if we have a really difficult task, we're going to do better at that task if we have low levels of activation or low levels of arousal or smaller emotions. Whereas if we have something very, very simple, we might benefit from having those heightened levels of arousal. I will again remind us that while that law tends to have some experiments that have supported it, overall, it isn't a guaranteed it works in every scenario thing. Where other people will say things like, hey, from this maximal adaptability model, we're actually really good at handling stress. And we tend to actually be able to perform really well, even with high levels of emotion and high stress, simply because we're very adaptable. So humans tend to do fairly well, even in what would have been considered high stress levels. But it all depends on the types of tasks, and it also depends really dramatically on the individual. So again, we'll get into eventually some of our disorders in the next chapter, but things like individuals with ADHD tend to thrive under high pressure scenarios because having a deadline actually gets them to start working effectively. So emotions was kind of a muddy refresher of a bunch of stuff we've talked about, and us concluding that it's really complicated and it's pulling from a lot of different information and it's really hard to predict. So maybe we should just talk about our next topic, which is our physiological responses. And if you're not a huge fan of the wishy-washy, there isn't a clear-cut connection, the physiological responses are actually a little bit more plain. The downside being that they are physiological, meaning that we're going to be talking about specific parts of the brain and the different neurotransmitters and the different hormones released in different places and how it affects our bodies. But we can at least talk about known pathways and known triggers and known things that are going to activate different parts of the body. So this is a very different approach, hence it getting its own section. But a lot of this section, we're going to be talking about stuff that relates to homeostasis, which again is one of those concepts we've talked about multiple times. But homeostasis is that state of balance within our bodies. And our arguments here would be saying that, okay, well, homeostasis is going to be set out of balance. We're going to get out of our homeostatic balance because of stressors. And our responses to those stressors, that internal stress response, our physiological response, is going to help push us back into balance. So something in our environment is going to knock us off of our balance point, and our body is going to try and push everything back to where we are happy again. So this is all about being in an equilibrium state. And so we've described this before, things like temperature and pressure and stuff like that. This also applies to different hormone levels and neurotransmitter levels and all sorts of stuff. But our bodies have a window for pretty much everything where we are going to optimally function. And these environmental stressors get us out of that window, and our bodies try and do everything in their power to get us back to that. So the stress response is going to basically protect us from potential harm and bring us back into balance. And this ends up being a nice coordinated response between multiple systems throughout our body that helps us mobilize energy. Basically, we're going to activate different systems, free up resources to help us deal with a stressor, to help us avoid the potential injury that might come from that stressful event, and help handle the aftermath. So if we were injured in a threatening encounter, our bodies might compensate and actually protect us against some of the consequences. So if we were injured, we actually find that our immune systems end up going into overdrive to help prevent injury, or I guess prevent infection from that injury. So there's a whole bunch of different things that are at work here, and a lot of this has been influenced by, as we might be not surprised to learn, natural selection and evolution to stay alive and sort of live longer lives. So for some of our brain areas, this is sort of a refresher because we've mentioned pretty much all of these areas multiple times before, but we're going to mention them again. So our prefrontal cortex, that's that front point in our frontal lobe, and that's where we're putting together information from multiple other areas. This is an association cortex. We're pulling info from other places, and we're evaluating, we're thinking, we're critically deciding, we're going to make a determination. So if we are facing something threatening, we're going to listen to that incoming sensory information that says this is what the threat is. We're going to listen to our memories of past experiences. We're going to project forward and look at what are some of those possible outcomes, what are some of our consequences, now what is the best course of action, and let's do that. If you remember our thalamus is involved in our incoming sensory information. It ends up being one of our relay stations. So our thalamus is where we split that incoming sensory info. We send some of it off to our sensory cortex to be processed and thought about intentionally. But we also have it splitting off and heading over to our amygdala so that we can have that really quick sort of gut response, which is really important if something is threatening to us physically. And then, of course, the amygdala is where we make those responses. It's where we're going to mostly have our fear or anger responses. So our amygdala gets involved in triggering that fight or flight. It's going to ramp up our autonomic nervous system because it's trying to get us ready automatically to prepare for that threat. We also have our hippocampus, and our hippocampus is involved in our memory. So it's involved in not just our consolidation of memory, meaning we're storing memories away for future use, it also helps us with the retrieval of memory. And it actually ends up integrating not just the information about the memory itself, but also the emotions that tie to that memory. So if the hippocampus is pulling a memory of a time when we were afraid, we actually also get an echo of activation in the amygdala because of that remembered fear. So the systems all work together really, really nicely. And if all of that information was a lot, that's all just review. We're actually going to go into the specifics with written stuff on the next slide, so no worries. The amygdala is a great place to start because that's where we're linking into emotions. So our amygdala allows us to respond rapidly to potential stressors. And this is where we get that fast, early response to stress. This isn't necessarily always correct, but it's our gut response. So if something has the potential to be threatening, it's going to trigger our amygdala. But like I said, we have that thalamus that splits our information. So some of it goes off to that sensory cortex, our somatosensory cortex, where we say, hey, what is it that we are experiencing? If we then determine that I jumped and my heart started racing, we turned on that fight or flight response, but I jumped because my sibling hopped out from behind a door, which my younger sister absolutely loves doing because I am a jumpy soul. So I would have that ramping up moment. I'd start panicking, and then I register, oh no, it's just her again. Okay, I can calm down again. So we can counteract that. We can turn on the opposite system and bring us back into homeostasis. So it's evolutionarily beneficial to have a fast response, but it also then helps to have a secondary system that helps us deactivate that response when we've had some more time to figure out if we actually need the response or not. So it's worth wasting some of the resources to ramp up and have a couple of, false starts, because we'd want to have an immediate response if it was a threatening scenario. And then it's going to work together with a bunch of other areas. So some of those higher areas, especially say our prefrontal cortex doing that consideration, is going to help us sort of wind everything down if necessary after some thinking and consideration. Like I said, hippocampus, learning and memory, storing and retrieving those memories. And then the prefrontal cortex is that higher order processing. It's how we put stuff together towards the end. All right, this next slide, we're going to slowly work our way into this. I'm going to start first, though, with the breakdown of our autonomic nervous system, where we have our sympathetic nervous system and our parasympathetic nervous system. And these are two systems where I refer to them collectively as the autonomic nervous system because I can never remember which one is which. I know that we have our fight or flight response, and we know that we have our counteracting response, but I can never remember which is which. But from the slide, the sympathetic nervous system is the fight or flight. That's what ramps us up. So when we're looking at our stress responses, it's our sympathetic nervous system that's kicking in. And what it's basically doing is causing everything we need to prepare for that threat. So our pupils dilate to let in more light, more information, more sensory info. We actually slow down and stop digestion because that's a useless drain on our resources. Everything else, though, is going to be ramping up. So we end up breathing faster to get more oxygen to our muscles. Our heart races faster to circulate that oxygen. And we end up having sort of constriction in our blood vessels to keep our blood to those core important functions. So everything's getting ready to deal with a stressful fight. And it's going to trigger the release of our stress hormones. So we'll talk about epinephrine and norepinephrine and a bunch of other stuff on the next slides. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is going to slow everything back down again. And they work opposingly to keep us in homeostatic balance.